that was meant to be. It occurred to me when I was putting together the video for this week that tomorrow being Easter, it was a good time to talk about me and God and Christ and the church and religion growing up. And it's another one of these stories that is really best told sort of all together. So I collected my thoughts on it because, once again, as this relates to the story, there are some extraordinary synchronistic events that happen in relation to this. And I think it's an important subject, given the context of everything, that I stop for a moment and just share, okay, Bob, so, tell me about your religious education and involvement. So Ed and Dee, my adoptive parents, I believe were both raised in the Methodist Church in Plainfield, which is called the Big United Methodist Church, or the Bum Church in town. And when I was born, I'm pretty sure that I was baptized in that church as an infant. And so I was baptized Methodist. But my family didn't go to church when I was growing up. And so the first time I even remember going to church was probably, I think, for an Easter service. And I remember going for the children's sermon and the pastor asking some question like, does anybody know what today is? And so I took it to be an authentic question, and so I began trying to answer it, of which I seem to not know what the date was. Apparently, when it came to the religious cycles, I wasn't in the loop. And so, there wasn't a lot of church activity in the household. I'm not even sure if we had more than a cross or two in the whole place, but I was obviously aware of it. My sister used to like to pull out the Bible and make me put my hand on the Bible to make sure I was telling the truth about something. And so these are just sort of where you find me when I get to fifth grade. And in fifth grade, I was in the class of Mr. Garvin, who happened to be the only, I'm almost certain of this, I think he was the only non-female teacher amongst the academic staff. There was a male gym teacher, and of course the band teacher was male as well. But I think he was the only male teacher in the entire building outside of those two. And his classroom after school once a week was being used by a woman who came in and did a religious program in the class for a couple of kids that would show up, and some kids that I knew in my class. And so I was there one afternoon and asked her, I think I inquired or she inquired me, and I don't remember exactly, but I do remember saying, oh, what's this? And, she eventually asked me, what's your name and who are you? And I said, I'm Bob Burke. And she says, oh, is your mom Dee Burke? And I said, yeah. And so she said, well, just tell her that you're with me and she'll be just fine, which was absolutely true. And so it was one of these moments where you realize that your mom and your dad may have more experience in the subject field than has been expressed to you by any stretch. And so around 6th or 7th grade, I want to say it was probably 7th grade, my mom had started going to the small Methodist church in town called Sharon United Methodist Church because a friend of hers from childhood that she used to ride the bus with was the church secretary and obviously attended the church for all the services. And so suddenly Mom was missing on Sundays. And so I finally joined her one Sunday, and after a while became a regular attendee at the church along with her. And I was confirmed Methodist, right? And I did readings, and I ushered, and I acolyted. I acolyted a lot, as it goes. And in fact, when I went to write the main commencement speech about 2 years later for the graduation ceremony, I actually sat down with the pastor, Pastor Steve, and I said, can you help me? How do I write this? I figured the guy writes a speech every week. So he's got to be fairly proficient at this. And I learned a lot watching the sermons being delivered. And so I got involved in all sorts of activities. I was involved, obviously, in the Sunday school program at that time, and I was very involved in the youth group. We did retreats, and then we also participated in regional events. And so that meant that I also participated and went up to Super Rally at Williams Bay in Wisconsin, on Lake Geneva, for the 4 years that I went for 4 years there. It was a very interesting and a great experience to go to that thing. And it was also the inspiration for the 2017 Libertarian Party of Wisconsin convention. I remember just the camaraderie and the time to just be on the property with people, sit around a fire, or chat in the gym. And it was a wonderful time, and I'm very grateful that I got to go to 4 years of that. It was the summer after my freshman year that I went on a mission trip with some of the folks from, I believe it was the Northern Illinois chapter, and we went down to southeast Kentucky. We drove down and we spent almost a week at a farm where you did a variety of different things. And so, we took care of pig pens, and we cut forests, and we moved an outhouse. We did do that, and a variety of other tasks like this. One of the really neat things, though, was that while there, getting our assignments one morning, the guy who's organizing it says to this other gentleman who's about to take some hogs into town, he says, "Do you want somebody to ride along with you? We got some extra folks today." He said, "Sure." And so he said, "Well, do you want to go, Bob?" And yeah, I got nothing else to do. So I got to go on a car ride into the city. I think it was Lexington at the time. And we rode through the most amazing limestone caverns. When you talk about things that really excite me about the electric universe geology, what sparked your interest? I mean, it's driving through places like this when I was a child. And I made some really interesting friends and some really great friends. And so after that summer mission trip, I was supposed to be doing the marching band routine at the halftime for the football game, playing bass drum again my sophomore year. And my heart just wasn't in it, to be honest with you. And part of the reason my heart wasn't in it was the gentlemen that I was playing the bass drum with weren't inspired either, and I wasn't enjoying myself. And so, in an odd synchronicity, I'm on my way home. I hadn't been planning to not go, but I was on my way home on my bike, and I passed the big United Methodist Church, and the pastor, the associate pastor there, and he said, I'm going over to meet some of the guys at the other church in Galena from the mission trip. If you're free and you'd like to come, we're going to talk about youth group activities and things to do for the Northern Illinois district. And I said, sure, let's do it. And that ended up being a very formative trip in some ways that I'll talk more about later in the future. I always loved going to church on Sunday mornings, especially when I was in high school, because Breakfast and the Beatles was playing on the radio on the way there, and then after church, if I ran out to get coffee and donuts, you'd always play Breakfast with the Beatles, and I just became such a huge fan of the Beatles that I remember saying to my mom one day, I'm like, wow, I mean, they weren't just the first really great rock band, but they were really good. And she said, well, yeah, I mean, they're the Beatles, and there were reasons that they were so fantastic. In 1986, I had this one very odd experience. Once again, as I look back on these things, and I went, just how odd. But there was going to be a multi-church event in Plainfield, and I don't recall exactly what it was about or what it was for. I mean, this was, 40 years ago, and so 35 years ago. And so I just remember that they came to me from the church, at our church, and the coordinators, and they said, Bob, what they'd like to do is that they're going to march through Plainfield, and they're looking for someone to carry this large wooden cross. Would you be willing to carry the cross for us? Yeah, I mean, I didn't see any downside. What I hadn't realized was that not only would the marchers and such be in a picture, but that picture would end up in the local newspaper as well. And my English teacher, actually my speech teacher, I believe it was Mrs. Sprague, actually commented to me that she had seen it. And I hadn't really realized that what I was doing was going to be seen by more than just the people there, but not that I have any problem with it, obviously, but it was just interesting. So if you want to see what that whole amount was about, that whole event was about, there was a whole news article that was written with it in the local newspaper. In my senior year, I was working at Just Pants in the mall, and I made a very good friend by the name of Anita. And Anita and I used to just pal around a lot, and we used to like to get together after work on Sundays. We always worked on Sundays. And because we went into work at 10 o'clock on Sundays, or 10:30 for me, I think it was, she didn't get to go to church, and so, or chose not to. In any case, she was Catholic, and so she and I would go to the youth service at the Catholic Church on Sunday nights. And I hadn't thought about this part until recently. I actually started singing. They had a group of singers up front. I volunteered to come in for the next week and be one of the singers up front to lead everybody in singing. There were probably 5 or 6 or 8 of us up there. And I remember I was in school the next day, and when I talked about getting this can of soda sprayed in my face, when that happened with this guy here, his brother came off of the top balcony at me too. And it was funny because a few weeks before that, he had been the guy who walked up to me and said, "Oh, I saw you singing at the church the other day." And it was interesting because I'd never had a real connection with the gentleman. It was kind of a turbulent little couple of weeks there, but it was interesting. So I attended 2 services on Sundays, the Methodist Church in the morning and the Catholic service in the evening. The most synchronous event attached to me in going to church, though, has to be the service that was held, I believe it was the week before I went into the Air Force, so sometime in late October. And because I was leaving and going into the Air Force, there was a small segment of the service which had been carved out to do a little blessing for me. And I remember being in the pew and sitting there because they had a guest speaker, a guest pastor that day, and they were in from out of town. It wasn't because our pastor wasn't there. This was a special speaker. And not because of me. This gentleman is going to come in. He's a special speaker. And by the way, we're also going to be doing this thing for Bob. And so, he got up there and he gave his homily, and then we got on with the service and we did my little bit. And then I remember it just being a very fascinating experience, knowing that I was going to be leaving and that they'd had this service. About 20 years later, I would take my wife and my daughters to Great America from our sailboat up in Door County. We said, hey, let's go down to Great America and spend the day at Great America with the girls. They were about 8 and 9. And then what we're going to do then is we'll go down to Plainfield for the night, get a hotel, and then tomorrow morning we'll go to church at Sharing United Methodist Church. Completely unannounced. I haven't been there in 20 years. We're going to show up. And it turned out that day they had a guest speaker. And so, you get to know everybody. I mean, I knew a lot of the people that I knew were still there. And so you get talking to them and say hi and hello, and you're meeting people. And then you find out they have a guest speaker that day from out of town. And the gentleman gets up, and he's in front of the lectern, in the pulpit, and he thanks us for having him back. The last time he had been there was 20 years ago. The exact same person as the day that I left in the Air Force and I reunited at the church. It has to be close to 20 years. And much later, as I got into the books, I started to look back and I realized that many of these synchronicities they're just too large to ignore, like that one. I fell away from the church, if you will, during my Air Force years and then back when I was in Door County and living down in Aurora. But I made a commitment to try and return to Christ when I moved back to Door County. And when I met my future wife, she and her family were Missouri Synod Lutherans. And so I joined the church when I got to college, actually. And that church is the church that you find me at in this part of the story, last week's story, the 2 weeks ago story, which is that I was going to a church in River Falls now, and it was a very liberal Missouri Lutheran church. And not just liberal, but the pastor, when I first arrived in college, was a very unique gentleman who had spent time studying religion in India and had a very unique sense of a greater spirituality that I really, really enjoyed. And it was one of the reasons why that church felt like and became very much my home for the next couple of decades. With that, I thank you very much for listening to today's video, and I hope you'll tune in again next week when I pick up the story as we go into GE Financial and the sales support later. Thank you. Peace. Let there be peace.